The letter that would change everything arrived on a Tuesday in April of 1885, tucked between a bill for coal and a black-bordered notice from the undertaker, and Stella Sawyer read it 3 times before she let herself believe the words on the page. Her father had been buried only 6 weeks, the consumption finally winning the fight it had waged against him for 2 long winters, and the little house in Columbus, Ohio, had been sold to pay what remained of his debts. Stella had $22, a trunk of clothes, her mother's cameo brooch, and a heart still raw with grief when the advertisement caught her eye in the back pages of the newspaper. Fertile land in the Copper Creek Valley of Montana Territory, 160 acres with a running creek and stands of good timber, available to any honest settler willing to pay the modest sum of $150 to secure the deed through the Coal Land and Emigration Company of Cheyenne. She had written that very night, enclosing every dollar she had left after selling her father's pocket watch and the parlor furniture, and when the deed arrived stamped with an official-looking seal and signed in a flourishing hand by a Mr. Cornelius Cole, she had wept with relief. She was 24 years old, unmarried, with no family left to speak of, and for the first time since her father's death, she had something that felt like a future. She boarded the train west in the last week of August, riding the rails as far as they went before transferring to a rattling stagecoach that carried her the final hard miles into Montana Territory. And by the time she stepped down into the dust of Copper Creek's single street in the second week of September, she had crossed nearly 2,000 miles to reach a home she had never seen. The town was smaller than she had imagined, a huddle of clapboard buildings and false fronts beneath the shoulders of the Absaroka Mountains, the air already carrying the bite of an early autumn that would soon turn to snow. She smoothed her traveling dress, gathered her courage along with her trunk, and asked the station master where she might find the land office. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he pities before he has even heard the whole story, and that look should have warned her, but hope is a stubborn thing, and Stella Sawyer had crossed too many miles to let a stranger's pity turn her back now. The land office in Copper Creek was a narrow room at the back of the general store, presided over by a spectacled clerk named Mr. Higgins, who had clearly delivered bad news before and had developed no gentler way of doing it. He took her deed, turned it over twice, held it up to the window light, and set it down upon the counter with the careful sorrow of a man laying a body in a coffin. "Miss Sawyer," he said, "I am sorry to tell you that there is no such parcel recorded in this territory. The numbers on this deed do not correspond to any survey we have on file. I have seen papers like this before, 3 times this year alone. There is no Coal Land and Emigration Company registered in Cheyenne or anywhere else that the territorial government has record of. I'm afraid you have been the victim of a swindle, and not the first, nor I fear the last." Stella stood very still, the way one stands when the floor has not yet finished disappearing beneath one's feet. "There must be some mistake," she said. "The letter was so detailed. It spoke of the creek, the timber, the exact section and township." "Fine details are the swindler's whole trade, miss," Mr. Higgins said gently. "The more particular the lie, the more folks believe it. I truly am sorry." She did not cry in front of him. She thanked him for his honesty, gathered the worthless deed back into her reticule, and walked out into the street with her spine straight and her mind entirely blank, because she did not yet know how to think about a future that had just been erased. The boarding house where she took a room that first week was run by a widow named Mrs. Pruitt, a sharp-tongued but not unkind woman who charged fair rates and asked few questions, at least at first. Stella's remaining money, the few dollars left over from her fare, and the sale of a ring she had not been able to part with until now, lasted a week and a half before Mrs. Pruitt's tone began to change, before the widow's grown son Ellis began to linger too long in doorways and offer to settle her account, in ways that made Stella's skin crawl. She was given until Saturday to pay what she owed or find other arrangements, and Saturday was 2 days away, and Stella Sawyer had nowhere else in the entire territory to go. It was on the Thursday before that reckoning that Josiah Brooks rode into Copper Creek with a season's worth of furs strapped behind his saddle, and no notion at all that his life was about to be rearranged. He was a big man, built through the shoulders and forearms the way a man gets built by 20 years of felling timber and hauling traps and wrestling green hides into submission. His dark hair grown past his collar, because there was no barber worth trusting within 40 miles of his cabin, and he had long since stopped caring what Copper Creek thought of his appearance. He kept to the high country above the valley, trapping and running a small herd of cattle on land he had claimed and proved up honestly 8 years before, and he came to town perhaps once a month, traded his furs and hides at the general store, bought what powder and coffee and flour he could not do without, and rode back out before nightfall if he could help it. Town wearied him in ways the mountains never did. Too many eyes, too many opinions, too much noise where a man could not hear his own thoughts. He was standing at the counter of the general store counting out his credit against a list of supplies when he heard the commotion from the boarding house next door. A woman's voice raised not in hysteria, but in a controlled, furious dignity that made him set down the sack of flour he was holding and step outside to see what the matter was. Ellis Pruitt had Stella's trunk in the dirt of the street, her belongings half spilled from it, and he was saying something about how a woman who could not pay ought to be willing to earn her keep in other ways, and Stella was standing over her scattered possessions with her chin lifted, and her eyes bright with a fury that had not yet decided whether it would spill over into tears. "I have told you," she was saying, "that I will find honest work in this town or I will walk to the next one, but I will not be spoken to in that manner by you or by anyone, and if you touch my belongings again, I will take that shovel from beside your mother's door and use it on you." It was, Josiah would think later, the shovel remark that first won his admiration. "Is there trouble here?" he said, and though he did not raise his voice, something in the low, unhurried weight of it made Ellis Pruitt step back a full pace. "No trouble, Brooks," Ellis said. "Just a matter of a woman who can't pay her lodging." "I can pay," Stella said, rounding on this new arrival with the same fire she had aimed at Ellis. "I simply need a day or two more, which is no crime, and if you have come to lecture me, as well you may save your breath, sir, whoever you are." Josiah looked at her for a long moment, this small, furious woman standing in the dust with her trunk spilled open around her feet, chin up, eyes wet but refusing to fall, and something in his chest that had been quiet and closed for a very long time gave a slow, unfamiliar turn. "I have not come to lecture anybody," he said. "I have come to buy flour. Pruitt, pick up the lady's trunk and set it back inside where it belongs, and you will do it now, or I will mention to the sheriff how many times folks have complained about your hands finding their way onto women who did not ask for them." Ellis Pruitt's face went red, but he did as he was told, and when the trunk was righted and the spilled clothing gathered back into it, Josiah Brooks turned to Stella, and in the plain, unadorned way of a man who has spent more of his life talking to horses than to people, asked her what in the world had brought a woman like her all the way out to Copper Creek with nowhere to sleep and no money to sleep there. She told him. She had not meant to tell a stranger her whole sad story in the middle of a dusty street, but something about the steadiness of his gaze, the lack of pity or judgment in it, loosened her tongue, and the whole tale came pouring out. Her father, the debts, the advertisement, the deed to land that did not exist, the last of her money gone to a swindler's careful lie. Josiah listened without interrupting, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, looking not at her but out toward the mountains that stood blue and serrated against the afternoon sky. "Coal Land and Emigration Company," he said at last. "I have heard that name before. There's a man been selling paper deeds to good land that don't exist all through this territory and the next, preying on folks back east who don't know one township from another. Sheriffs had letters about him from 3 other towns. Then, "I am not the only fool," Stella said bitterly. "You are not a fool," Josiah said, and something in the flat certainty of his voice made her look up at him properly for the first time, taking in the breadth of his shoulders beneath his worn buckskin coat, the weathered lines at the corners of eyes the color of good strong coffee, the calm, unhurried strength of him that seemed to make the whole chaotic street settle around him like water around a stone. "A fool is a man who lies for profit and sleeps easy after. You are a woman who trusted a piece of paper because you had nowhere else to put your trust. That is not foolishness. That is grief looking for a door." Stella felt her eyes sting in a way that had nothing to do with Ellis Pruitt's insults, and she looked away quickly, embarrassed by how much the stranger's plain kindness had undone her. "I do not know your name," she said. "Josiah Brooks," he said. "I keep a claim up in the high valley about 6 miles north. Good land, proved up honest, cattle and timber, and a creek that actually runs where the map says it does." A faint, dry humor touched the corner of his mouth as he said it, and Stella found to her own surprise that she almost smiled back. "I have a cabin with 2 rooms," he went on, more carefully now, as though weighing each word before he spent it. "Built it myself, and there is a spare room that has stood empty since my old partner Amos went back to Missouri 2 winters past. It is no fine boarding house, but it is dry and it is honest, and you would be safe there, Miss Sawyer, until you decide what you mean to do next. I would not ask anything of you in return, but that you not be afraid of me, which I understand may be a hard thing to promise a woman who has just been swindled by one stranger and harassed by another." Stella studied him for a long moment. He was, by any measure, an enormous and rough-looking man, his hands scarred and calloused, a hunting knife at his belt, furs still strapped behind his saddle, and every instinct that Eastern propriety had ever taught her screamed that a respectable woman did not go off alone into the mountains with a man she had known for the length of one conversation. But she thought of Ellis Pruitt's hands, and Mr. Higgins's sorrowful face, and the deed that promised land that had never existed at all, and she thought that perhaps propriety had already failed her once this year, and perhaps it was time to trust something else instead. She thought, too, of the steadiness in Josiah Brooks's voice when he told her she was not a fool, and how badly she had needed someone to say it. "I have very little to offer in return for such kindness," she said. "I did not ask for anything in return," Josiah said. "But if it eases your mind, you can cook. I have eaten my own cooking for 8 years, and I promise you it has not improved with practice." It was absurdly that small dry joke that decided her, because it told her something true about him, that beneath the sighs and the silence there was a man who could laugh at himself, and a man who could laugh at himself was rarely a man to be feared. "Then I accept, Mr. Brooks," she said, "with gratitude, and I promise you my cooking is a good deal better than my judgment about land agents." The wagon ride up out of Copper Creek and into the foothills took the better part of 3 hours, the town shrinking behind them into a scatter of gray roofs, while the mountains rose ahead in slow, magnificent increments, pine and spruce climbing the slopes in dark green ranks, the air growing cleaner and colder with every mile. Stella sat beside Josiah on the wagon seat with her trunk lashed behind them, watching the country change, and found herself unable to stop stealing glances at the man beside her, at the easy strength with which he handled the team, the quiet way his eyes swept the tree line now, and again, out of some deep habit of watchfulness that she suspected had kept him alive through more winters than she could imagine. "Why did you leave off keeping company with people?" she asked at last, because the silence between them, while not uncomfortable, seemed to want filling, and take up living alone in the mountains. Josiah did not answer right away, and she thought she had overstepped, but then he said, in the same unhurried way he seemed to say everything, "I was engaged to be married once, back in Tennessee, before the war ended and I came west. Her name was Margaret. I went off to fight and came home with less to offer than I had before I left, and by the time I got back she had already married a man who owned a dry goods store and never had to leave the state to prove it. I do not blame her for it now. But I found I did not much care for Towns after that, and Towns did not much care for a man who preferred silence to conversation. So I came out here, and I found land that wanted nothing from me but honest work, and cattle that never once compared me to a man who sold buttons for a living, and I have been content enough. Content, Stella repeated. Not happy. Josiah glanced sideways at her, surprised she thought that she had caught the distinction. No, he admitted. Not happy. Content is what a man settles for when happy has stopped seeming likely. Stella thought of her own father's slow decline, of the years of nursing him while her own youth slipped by unmarked, of the letter that had promised her a future and delivered only ash. I think I understand that better than I would like to, she said. They rode the rest of the way mostly in silence, but it was a different silence now, one that had a little more trust folded into it than before. Josiah's cabin, when they reached it in the fading gold light of late afternoon, sat in a wide meadow beneath a shoulder of gray rock, a creek running clear and cold along one edge of the clearing, cattle grazing in the middle distance, smoke already curling from a stone chimney where he had banked coals that morning. It was, Stella thought, exactly the picture that the fraudulent letter had painted for her, except that here it was real, solid, standing in the actual dirt of an actual valley, instead of existing only in a con man's careful prose. It is beautiful, she said, and meant it entirely. It is home, Josiah said simply, and helped her down from the wagon with a hand that was rough and warm and entirely careful of her. The spare room, when he showed it to her, was small but clean, a real bed with a good wool blanket, a washstand, a single window that looked out toward the mountains. Josiah had clearly spent the ride home mentally cataloging what needed doing, because he set about it at once, hauling in fresh water, splitting kindling for her stove, showing her where the root cellar kept its stores of potatoes and dried meat and preserved vegetables, all with the brisk, unshowy competence of a man who had learned long ago that talk was cheap and usefulness was not. That first supper she cooked with the ingredients he showed her, a simple stew of dried beef and potatoes and onions, and when he tasted it his eyebrows rose in what she took to be genuine astonishment. I withdraw my earlier claim, he said. This is considerably better than my cooking. Your cooking would have to be quite poor for that to be much of a compliment, she said, and he laughed, a real laugh, low and surprised out of him as though he had not expected to make the sound, and Stella felt something warm bloom in her chest at having caused it. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that Stella had not expected to find so quickly comfortable. She cooked and kept the cabin, mended what needed mending, and in the mornings when Josiah rode out to check his cattle or run his trap lines along the creek, she often walked with him, learning the shape of the land, the names of the peaks that ringed the valley, the different calls of the hawks that wheeled above the meadow. He taught her, patiently, and without any of the condescension she might have expected from a man of his rough experience, how to load and fire the old rifle he kept by the door, how to tell a black bear's track from a grizzly's, which berries were safe to eat, and which would make a person violently regret their curiosity. In turn, she found small ways to repay his kindness, beyond the cooking and mending. She discovered his account books were a mess of half-legible figures, and offered to put them in order, sitting at his table in the evenings by lamplight with a ledger and a pencil, tallying the value of furs against supplies bought on credit. And Josiah watched her work with an expression she caught once, when she looked up unexpectedly, that made her heart trip strangely in her chest, something between wonder and hunger that he quickly smoothed away when he saw her notice it. You are better with numbers than I ever was, he admitted one such evening. I never had much schooling. Learned to read well enough from my mother before she passed, and to write my name and figure simple sums, but the rest came hard and slow. I could teach you if you wished it, Stella offered, My father was a schoolteacher for a time before his health failed. I have some skill at it. Josiah considered this for a long moment, and something in his face, some old, buried embarrassment, told her the offer touched a tender place in him. I would like that, he said finally, if it would not be too much trouble. It was, she found, no trouble at all, and became instead one of the great pleasures of her days. The two of them bent together over a slate, and a primer she had brought from her own girlhood, Josiah's big scarred hands holding the chalk with a care that made her chest ache. His slow, determined progress from halting syllables to whole confident sentences filling her with a pride she had not expected to feel so fiercely for another person's small victories. It was 3 weeks into her stay, with the first hard frost silvering the meadow grass each morning and the aspens along the creek gone entirely to gold, that the mountains showed Stella Sawyer a different and more dangerous face. She had walked out alone that morning, against Josiah's gentle but firm instruction that she never go far from the cabin without him, drawn by the sight of a particular stand of chokecherry bushes heavy with fruit that she thought would make a fine preserve. She had wandered farther than she intended, following the curve of the creek around a rocky outcrop that hid the cabin from view, and it was there, crouched with her basket half full, that she heard the low, unmistakable huff of a bear somewhere in the brush ahead of her. She froze. The huff came again, closer, and through a gap in the willows she saw the massive dark shape of a grizzly, its head low, testing the air, no more than 30 yards distant and between her and the safest path home. Every instruction Josiah had given her about bears ran through her mind at once, a jumbled, useless litany, and she was still trying to decide whether to back away slowly or stand her ground when the bear's head swung toward her, and its small dark eyes fixed on her with an attention that turned her blood to ice water. She did not scream. She would tell Josiah later that she had been too frightened even to manage that, but in truth, some deep animal instinct kept her utterly silent as she began, with agonizing slowness, to back away along the creek bank. And it was in that same instant that she heard Josiah's voice ring out across the clearing, low and commanding, not shouting but pitched to carry. "Stella, do not run. Walk toward the sound of my voice, slow as you can, and keep your eyes down." She obeyed without question, her heart hammering, and as she moved she saw him step out from the trees on the far side of the clearing, his rifle raised but not fired, moving with a deliberate, unhurried confidence that seemed almost impossible given the size of the animal between them. He began speaking to the bear in a low, steady stream of words that meant nothing and everything, the same tone he used to calm a spooked horse, and the great animal, after a long, terrible moment of consideration, huffed once more, dropped its head, and ambled off into the brush with a final disgruntled swipe at a berry bush, as though it had merely been mildly inconvenienced by the whole encounter. The moment it was gone, Josiah crossed the clearing in a few long strides and caught Stella by the shoulders, and she realized only then how badly she was shaking. "You could have been killed," he said, and his voice, for the first time since she had known him, was not steady at all. "I know," she managed. "I am sorry. I only wanted the chokecherries. I did not think." "I know you did not think," he said, and there was real fear in his voice beneath the roughness, fear that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with how close he had just come to losing her, and the realization of that struck Stella with a force greater than the bear's had been. "I cannot lose you, Stella. Do you understand me? I have already—" He stopped himself, jaw tight, and did not finish the sentence, but he did not need to, because Stella understood it perfectly, understood it in the way his hands trembled slightly where they gripped her shoulders, in the way his eyes searched her face as though reassuring himself she was truly whole and unharmed. "Josiah," she said softly, using his given name for perhaps the first time, and something in the sound of it seemed to undo the last of his composure. "I have watched you these 3 weeks," he said, low and rough, "learning to be brave when you have every right to be broken, and I have told myself every day that you are only passing through my life on your way to some better fortune than mine, and every day it has become harder to believe I do not want you to stay in it entirely." Stella's breath caught. "Josiah Brooks," she whispered, "are you telling me you love me?" "I am telling you," he said, "that I have loved very little in this world since the war, and I did not expect to love anything again. And then a woman with a worthless deed and a chin like iron walked into my life, and I have not had a full night's peaceful sleep since, because I lie awake thinking of her instead." She laughed, a startled, joyful sound with tears mixed into it, and he bent his head slowly, giving her every chance to step back if she wished it. But she did not step back, and when his mouth finally found hers, it was gentle at first, careful, as though he still could not quite believe he was allowed this, and then less careful, as her arms came up around his neck, and she answered him with an eagerness that told him plainly enough that his feelings were not walking this road alone. When at last they drew apart, both a little breathless, Josiah rested his forehead against hers and let out a long, unsteady laugh. "I believe," he said, "we ought to go home before I forget every manner my mother ever taught me." "I believe," Stella said, smiling against his cheek, "I would not entirely mind if you did." But he was, in the end, a careful and honorable man, and though the weeks that followed were sweeter and warmer between them than Stella had ever imagined a mountain autumn could be, he did not press her for more than she offered, content instead to walk beside her, to hold her hand by the fire in the evenings, to steal kisses in the doorway before he rode out each morning, while the question of what her future truly held remained, for now, unspoken between them. A happiness too new and too fragile to be examined too closely just yet. It was in the first week of October, with snow already dusting the high peaks and the valley bracing for winter, that trouble rode into Copper Creek in the shape of a well-dressed stranger with a black leather case and a voice like poured honey. Josiah heard of it first from the storekeeper on his next trip to town, and he brought the news back to the cabin with a grim set to his jaw that Stella had not seen on him since the day of the bear. "There's a man in Copper Creek," he said, laying his hat on the table, "calling himself Cornelius Cole, selling deeds to good bottomland along the North Fork for $150 an acre, promising fertile soil and running water to any fool with cash in hand. Storekeeper says he has already sold 4 parcels this week to families just off the stage." Stella went very still, her hands frozen over the bread dough she had been kneading. "Cole," she repeated, "the same name as my deed." "The very same," Josiah said. "I do not believe there are 2 men in this territory bold enough to use that name after word of the first swindle got about. I believe he never left. I believe he has simply been working the smaller towns these past weeks, waiting for Copper Creek to forget his face, and now he has come back to finish robbing anyone he missed the first time." Fury rose in Stella so swiftly and completely that it startled her, burning away the last soft residue of grief that had lingered since Mr. Higgins first told her the truth of her own worthless deed. She thought of every family newly arrived on the stage, every hopeful letter written back east, every dollar scraped together and sent west in trust, and she thought that she would not, could not, stand by and let it happen to one more soul if there was any way at all to stop it. "We have to go into town," she said. "We have to stop him." "We," Josiah said, and something in the word, in the easy way he accepted her place beside him in the fight without question, warmed her even through her anger. "Yes, we do." They rode into Copper Creek the following morning, the frost thick on the ground and their breath clouding white in the cold, and found the town more crowded than Stella had seen it since her arrival, wagons and horses tied along the main street. A small knot of newly arrived families gathered outside the hotel where, according to the sign chalked on a board propped against the wall, Mr. C. Cole, land agent, was conducting business by appointment within. Stella recognized him the instant she stepped through the door, though she had never laid eyes on him before, because he looked exactly as his letters had sounded, polished and confident, his suit too fine for the frontier, his smile too ready, his voice smooth as he spread a map across the hotel's small table for a young couple who watched him with the same desperate hope Stella herself had once carried across 2,000 miles. "Mr. Cole," she said, and her voice carried clearly across the room, silencing his patter mid-sentence. "I believe you sold me a deed to 160 acres in the Copper Creek Valley this past spring. Perhaps you recall the transaction. I paid $150 for land that, according to the Territorial Land Office, has never existed." Cole's smile did not waver, but something flickered behind his eyes, a swift calculation. "Madam, I am afraid you have mistaken me for someone else." "I have not," Stella said, drawing the worthless deed from her reticule and laying it upon the table beside his map, the signature at the bottom matching his own hand exactly, a detail she had thought to bring precisely for this purpose. "This is your signature, is it not? The same hand that has just drawn boundary lines on that map for these good people, promising them land along a North Fork that Mr. Higgins at the land office assures me was surveyed a decade ago and belongs, every acre of it, to the Northern Pacific Railway, which has never sold so much as a single parcel of it to any private buyer." A murmur went through the small crowd that had gathered, the young couple at the table drawing back from Cole as though his very touch might now be contaminated. Cole's composure cracked at last, his eyes darting toward the door, and Josiah, who had been standing quietly by the entrance, stepped forward and planted himself squarely in the man's path with the immovable patience of a mountain. "I would not," Josiah said mildly, "if I were you." It was the sheriff, summoned by the storekeeper's boy at a dead run, who arrived minutes later to find Cornelius Cole sitting rigid and pale in a hotel chair, while half the town's newest arrivals produced letters and deeds of their own, each one matching the pattern, each one worthless, and Stella stood at the center of it all with her own deed in hand, no longer ashamed of it but holding it up as evidence, as proof, as the very thing that would finally see justice done. "There is a federal marshal due through in a fortnight on the circuit," the sheriff said, clapping a firm hand on Cole's shoulder. "I expect he will be very interested to make your acquaintance, Mr. Cole, and to hear from every family you have robbed between here and Cheyenne." Cole was led away to the small jail behind the sheriff's office, and the crowd that remained in the hotel parlor turned, almost as one, to look at Stella with an expression she had not received from strangers in a very long time, something like gratitude, something like respect. "You saved us," the young wife said, clutching her husband's arm. "We had given him nearly everything we had left." "I only wish someone had done the same for me," Stella said, "before I ever signed my own name to his lies, but perhaps that is why I am glad I could do it for you instead." Josiah watched her from across the room, this woman who had arrived in his life clutching a worthless piece of paper and a broken heart, now standing tall and unshaken in the center of a crowded hotel parlor, having just brought down the very swindler who had wronged her, and he felt something settle in his chest with the finality of a key turning in a lock. He had known for weeks that he loved her. He knew now, watching her, that he could not imagine a single day of his life going forward without her standing beside him exactly like this, unafraid, righteous, entirely herself. That evening, as they rode back toward the mountains beneath a sky just beginning to prick with stars, Josiah reached over and took her hand from the reins, holding it tightly in his own. "Stella," he said, "I have been thinking on something, and I want to say it plainly, because I have learned this year that plain words serve a person better than pretty lies ever will." "Say it then," she said, her heart already quickening. "That deed you carry," he said, "promised you land that never existed. A creek that was never there. Timber that was only ink on paper. I cannot undo what was taken from you, the money, the hope, the 2,000 miles you crossed believing in a lie. But I have land, Stella. Real land with a creek that runs exactly where I tell you it runs, and timber you can put your hand against and feel the bark beneath your palm, and grass enough to feed cattle and children both, if we are blessed with either. I am asking you to let that land be yours as well as mine. I am asking you to be my wife." Stella did not answer at once, not because she was uncertain, but because her heart was too full for a moment to let the words pass. And when she finally found her voice, it came out rough with tears she made no effort to hide. "Josiah Brooks," she said, "I came west with a promise that turned out to be nothing but paper and lies, and I very nearly gave up believing that anything good could be built on trust again. But you have shown me every day since that a promise kept, even in small things, is worth more than every fine word that swindler ever wrote. Yes, yes, I will marry you. I will take your land and your name and your whole slow, steady heart, and I will guard all three of them as fiercely as you have guarded me." He pulled the wagon to a stop right there on the frozen road, mountains dark and vast around them, stars beginning to scatter thick overhead, and kissed her long and thoroughly, until she was laughing against his mouth, and he was laughing too, both of them giddy as children with the enormity of what had just been decided between them. They were married 3 weeks later, on a bright, cold morning in early November, in the small church at Copper Creek that Stella had once walked past on her way to a land office that would only break her heart. Mrs. Pruitt, who had softened considerably toward Stella after learning the full story of Cole's arrest, and had quietly dismissed her own son from her house once the truth of his conduct became widely known, insisted on providing a wedding cake despite Stella's protests that no such kindness was owed her. Mr. Higgins came, and the young couple whom Stella had saved from Cole's second swindle, and half the town besides, curious and warm and welcoming in a way that Stella, arriving that September as a stranger with nothing but a worthless deed, could never have predicted. Stella wore a dress of pale blue wool that Mrs. Pruitt had helped her sew, and Josiah wore a coat that had clearly been brushed and pressed with far more care than he usually spent on his appearance. His dark hair combed back, though a few stubborn locks escaped to fall across his forehead exactly as they always did. And when the preacher asked if he would take Stella Sawyer to be his wife, his voice rang out clear and certain across the small church, without a trace of the hesitation that had once made him retreat entirely from towns and their noise. "I will," he said, "and gladly, and for the rest of my life." Stella's own voice, when her turn came, was steady despite the tears standing bright in her eyes. "I will," she said, "with my whole heart, which I did not think I had left to give until he showed me otherwise." They rode back up to the valley that afternoon as husband and wife, the cabin waiting for them with smoke curling from the chimney where Josiah had banked the fire that morning before the ceremony. And Stella stood in the doorway of what was now truly her own home and looked out at the meadow, the creek, the dark ranks of pine climbing the mountainside, and felt, for the first time since her father's death, entirely and completely safe. That winter, the first snows came heavy and beautiful, burying the valley in white while Josiah and Stella spent the long evenings by the fire, he continuing his lessons in reading now for the simple pleasure of it rather than necessity, working his way through an entire worn copy of a novel Stella had carried across the country in her trunk, while she kept his account books in order and began, at his gentle urging, to write down the story of her journey west, the letter, the fraud, the finding of him. In a leather-bound journal he had bought for her on their last trip to town before the passes closed for the season. "Why do you want it written down?" she asked him one such evening, looking up from the page. "Because," Josiah said, "someday there may be children in this house who will want to know how their mother came to be here, and I would rather they hear it from her own honest words than from whatever exaggerated tale I am likely to tell them by then, in which I fought off 3 bears and a band of outlaws to win your hand." Stella laughed. "There was only the one bear." "The story improves with telling," he said, entirely unrepentant, and she threw a balled-up sock at him, which he caught without looking up from his book, a small domestic skirmish that ended, as most of their disagreements did that winter, in laughter and a long, warm embrace by the fire. Spring came late to the high valley, But when it came in a rush. The snow melting off the meadow in great silver sheets, the creek swelling loud and vigorous with runoff, the aspens budding green almost overnight. And it was in that season, with the whole valley waking around them, that Stella told Josiah she was carrying his child. He was silent for a long moment when she told him, standing very still in the yard with a coil of rope in his hands. And Stella, watching his face, felt a flicker of worry that she had misjudged his happiness until she saw that his eyes had gone bright and wet, and he set down the rope with great care, as though afraid his own hands might betray him, and crossed to her and lifted her clean off her feet in an embrace that left her breathless and laughing. "A child," he said, his voice cracking on the word. "Stella. A child here in this valley. Our child," she said, "in our home on our land. On land that exists," he said, half laughing, half weeping, pressing his forehead to hers. "Solid ground beneath its feet from the very first day, not a single lying letter in the whole of it." Their son was born in the depths of that following winter, a healthy, loud-voiced boy they named Thomas after Josiah's own father. And Stella labored through a long, hard night with Josiah at her side the entire time, having ridden through a driving snowstorm to fetch the midwife from town and back again, before the worst of the labor set in, refusing to leave her side for so much as a moment despite the midwife's insistence that such things were not a husband's place. When at last the child was placed in Stella's arms, red-faced and squalling and utterly perfect, Josiah knelt beside the bed and wept without any shame at all, and Stella, exhausted and radiant, reached up to brush the tears from his weathered face with a hand that trembled with its own overwhelming joy. "He has your chin," Josiah said, examining the child with the same careful attention he gave to everything he loved. "Stubborn already, I would wager." "Good," Stella said. "He will need it, growing up the son of a mountain man." 2 years after that, a daughter followed, whom they named Grace, born in the gentle warmth of early autumn with none of the drama of her brother's arrival, sliding into the world, as Josiah liked to say ever after, with the same quiet, contented certainty her father had once mistaken for the whole of what happiness could ever be, before Stella Sawyer arrived and taught him it could be so very much more. The years that followed were not without their hardships, as no years on the frontier ever truly were. There were winters hard enough to test even Josiah's considerable experience, a summer drought that thinned the herd and worried them both through long sleepless nights of calculation, a bout of fever that swept through Thomas as a small boy of 4 and left both his parents hollow-eyed with terror, until it broke at last on the 3rd night, and the child woke asking, with all the outrage of the very young, why nobody had thought to bring him anything to eat. But the hardships were faced together, always together, in a partnership that had been forged first in a dusty street in Copper Creek and tempered ever since by every storm and every joy that followed. And Stella never once, in all the years that followed, regretted the 2,000 miles she had crossed on the strength of a lie, because the lie, in the end, had only been the road that led her to something far more real than any letter had ever promised. The old deed to the land that never existed still hung framed on the wall of their cabin, a thing Stella had insisted on keeping despite Josiah's initial bafflement at the notion. And beside it, in a matching frame, hung the true deed to their valley land, both their names inscribed upon it in the careful hand of the Territorial Land Office clerk, Mr. Higgins himself having ridden up specially the year Thomas was born to see the new addition to the family, and to remark, with evident satisfaction, that he had rarely in his years of service seen a story turn out so entirely well from such an unpromising beginning. "I keep the false one," Stella explained to her children years later, when they were old enough to ask about the strange framed paper with its flourishing false signature and its promises of land that had never held so much as a single blade of grass. "So that you will always remember that not every promise made to you in this world will be kept, and that the measure of a person is not in the grandness of what they promise, but in the plainness of what they actually give." "And the other deed?" Thomas asked, a serious boy of 8 by then, standing between his parents with his sister's small hand held tightly in his own. "What does that one mean?" It was Josiah who answered, drawing Stella close against his side with an arm grown no less strong with the passing years, his dark hair silvering now at the temples, but his shoulders still broad enough to shelter his whole family beneath them when the mountain wind blew cold. "That one means," he said, "that your mother came west chasing a promise that was never real, and found instead a man who could not offer her anything so grand as a letter full of fine words, but who could offer her something better. Real ground, real seasons, a real home built one honest day at a time. That is the only kind of promise worth making, children, and the only kind worth keeping. And I have tried, every day since your mother stood in that street with her chin up and her trunk spilled in the dirt, to keep mine." Stella looked up at him then, at this man who had once retreated entirely from the world believing happiness was no longer likely for him, who had built a solid, quiet life alone in the mountains and never once expected it to be interrupted by love. And she thought of the girl who had stepped off the stagecoach in September of 1885 with a worthless deed clutched in her hand and grief still fresh in her heart. And she marveled at the distance between that frightened girl and the woman she had become, safe and loved and rooted deep in ground that had never once, not for a single day, failed to be exactly what it promised. "You have kept it," she said softly, "every single day." Outside, the valley stretched wide and green beneath the summer sun, the creek running exactly where it had always run, the mountains standing eternal and watchful around the home they had built together. And somewhere above the meadow a hawk wheeled and called, the same wild, free sound that had greeted Stella on her very first morning in this valley, when she had walked out with Josiah Brooks at her side and begun, without either of them quite realizing it yet, to fall in love with land that was, at long last, entirely and truly real. They lived out the rest of their years in that same valley, watching Thomas grow into a young man as steady and broad-shouldered as his father, watching Grace grow into a young woman with her mother's fierce chin and her father's quiet patience, watching the small homestead they had built together expand in time into a modest ranch that fed and sheltered not only their own family but, in the leaner years, several neighboring families besides. Because Josiah Brooks had never forgotten what it meant to be given shelter when a stranger had nothing, and he made certain his own door was never closed to anyone who came to it in genuine need. And on quiet evenings, when the work of the day was done and the fire had been banked and the children, grown now, had homes and families of their own scattered along the valley below, Stella and Josiah would sit together on the porch he had built the very first spring of their marriage, watching the sun go down gold and rose behind the peaks, and she would sometimes reach for his hand, weathered now with age but still strong, still warm, still exactly as steady as it had been on the day he first took the reins from a frightened woman's fumbling grip and told her, in that low, unhurried voice she had come to love more than any other sound in the world, that she was not a fool, only a woman, whose grief had gone looking for a door. "Any regrets, Mrs. Brooks?" he would ask her sometimes, an old joke between them by then, and she would answer every single time with the same words, because they were as true on their 40th telling as they had been on the first. "Only that it took a swindler's lie to bring me to the truth of you," she would say. "But I suppose some roads have to run through the worst of a place before they can lead you home." And Josiah Brooks, mountain man, rancher, husband, father, a man who had once believed happiness had stopped seeming likely for him, would draw his wife close against his side beneath the wide Montana sky, and think that no letter, however finely worded, however carefully sealed, had ever promised a man so much, or delivered in the end so very much more.